as I was saying before the session started, this is a reprise of my doctoral defense, um, a little less formal this time. So, Ani, I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that I'm presenting to you from Swakamak, otherwise known as Sudbury, Ontario, Canada. This is Robinson Huron 1850 Treaty Territory and the traditional lands of the Atikamekw Anishinaabe, which is a community descended from Ojibwa, Odawa, and Algonquin ancestors. My home is also situated just next to the traditional territory of Wanapate First Nation, so I want to acknowledge them as well. I love it here, and I'm really grateful to call this place my home. Whoops. My name's Jess, and as Becca alluded to, I just recently confirmed my completion of my doctorate in education through Athabasca University. I'm descended from Euro-Canadian and Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. I'm a professor and program coordinator at Cambrian College here in Swakamak, Sudbury. And I want to acknowledge how GoGN has been such a huge support to me throughout my doctoral journey. I'm so thrilled to be here today to present the results of my dissertation study titled Exploring Learners' Perceptions of an Open Renewable Assignment. So here's a little overview. My plan for the session is to begin with a really brief overview of the study. I'll get into a very quick summary of the review of literature, and I'll focus primarily on the methodological portion of the study, the methods utilized, and then end with findings, implication for future research, questions for practitioners, and a question for you all as I take this presentation and turn it into an extended workshop for an upcoming conference, which GoGN has so kindly offered me scholarship funding to participate in. All right, so here's my research question. There was just one central guiding question that informed my study, and it was, how do college students enrolled in a Truth and Reconciliation course, a course that focused on settler colonial harm and attempts to redress those harms, how did they experience the creation of a renewable assignment? And to contextualize the research question, I think it's important to unpack that term renewable assignment, although it might be pretty familiar to the folks in this space. So the image on the left side of your screen was my way of visualizing Wiley and Hilton's four-part criteria for OER-enabled pedagogy and renewable assignments. Their criteria was premised on four central assumptions. Students had to create an artifact of learning. The artifact should hold value beyond an individual student's learning. The artifact should be shared publicly, and it should be openly licensed, actually in the most permissible way as possible. College students enrolled in the fall 2020 and winter 2021 deliveries of this online course were invited to create final projects that had that potential to meet the criteria for renewable assignments and OER-EP. So my study explored in detail learners' perceptions, experiences with and perceptions of this very particular context-specific example of OER-EP. My study was also supported by an Eduaptmonk epistemological framing. So this encouraged me to approach the findings from both a Western and an Anishinaabe way of knowing. The term Anishinaabe refers to a group of culturally related Indigenous nations in my part of the world. My study included Algonquin teachings as well as Ojibwe teachings because that's the knowledge that's been gifted to me as a descendant of Algonquin peoples living here on primarily Ojibwe territory. So viewing the research question, the review of literature, the subsequent findings through these dual perspectives helped me to reveal complexities, contradictions, tensions, assumptions that otherwise I might have ignored or just missed. This is the gift of two-eyed seeing. When two or more perspectives are brought together, the outcomes tend to be improved. The conclusions tend to be more nuanced. And I first brought this relational thinking forward in my review of Lit. So I approached the review of literature by moving from central aspects of renewable assignments, OER-EP, outward. I explored concepts such as constructionism, constructivism, social constructivism, open licensing, OER, open educational practices, and I shared Anishinaabe Gikandosawan knowledge throughout. So, for example, I brought forward Anishinaabe practices that centered the power of learning through creating objects, as I discussed learning theories foundational to concepts of OER-EP and open pedagogy broadly. I then focused on OER created in Ontario, Canada, situating various OER on Gaudry and Lawrence's 2018 Indigenization Continuum. And then finally, I turned my attention toward the assumptions about knowledge and knowledge sharing practices that underpin licensing, copyright, and Creative Commons licenses as well. Turning to methodology now, so just as renewable assignments empower students to share their knowledge, interpretative phenomenological analysis, or IPA, also invites study participants to share their perceptions of a given phenomenon. So for me, it felt like a natural fit. Early in my study, I received some financial support from my university to participate in some virtual, it was COVID at the time, so virtual workshops specifically about IPA methodological practices. Um, it was really affirming for me. It helped me see that this was an appropriate methodological choice. The hermeneutic, ideographic, and phenomenological of IPA really met my question. And they also elaborated on the two guides I show on the screen here, which were comprehensive guides to conducting IPA research. So they just added some nuance and basically like calmed me down as I started on the process. There's some really clear trail markers when conducting IPA research, but there's also flexibility in the approach so that researchers can find ways that suit them best. So I'm going to give a detailed overview of what I did, but this isn't necessarily like the hard and concrete way of approaching IPA. My study involved 7 participants, and for each of the 7 participants, I flowed through the same process. In the early stages of IPA research, the focus has to be on respecting ideography. So each participant's story needs to stand alone. So for each participant, I started by conducting what they call an IPA interview, which is essentially a semi-structured interview guided by a series of questions that I shared with my participants prior. The interviews were conducted via Zoom because, again, we were in pandemic times, which wouldn't have been my first choice, but it worked. Um, so I conducted the interview, and after the participant logged off, I actually stuck around by myself in the Zoom room and talked, like reflected on how I thought the interview went, what I thought they shared that might be significant. I just thought it might be helpful to capture that reflection in the moment to have something to compare with a little bit later. To really respect the act of listening, I decided to transcribe my interview audio manually, which was a hugely time-consuming process. But I do feel it was worth it because it helped me get closer to the data, which is something I kept reading about in the IPA guides and hearing about at the workshops. So I created my transcript and then I reread it, listened to the audio again, corrected any incongruities or typos, and then I did that whole thing one more time before finally arriving at a phase where I could start a line by line analysis. So this was my first step into the analytic process. And the way that they suggested I go about this is underlining anything that felt important at the first go, and then taking a second pass being a bit more discerning, um, highlighting anything linguistically interesting in blue and conceptually interesting, or sorry, linguistics in green and conceptually interesting commentary in blue. So it looks something like this. Then I went back and I added descriptive annotations on the left margin and a second, or who knows what pass this is now, another pass adding analytic commentary on the right margin. So ultimately, my transcript started to look something like what you're seeing on your screen now. At this point, the researchers suggested that we pause. So, in getting great data with Dr. Jill Rodriguez, she suggested just stop at this phase and take a step away from the transcript, writing out a summary for yourself of the main gist. So, this is to help you start moving away from the like verbatim of the transcript, getting maybe a bit closer to an understanding of potential themes. So, that's what I did. And then I went back and tried to compare to that initial me alone in the Zoom room reflection to see if I could find anything interesting. Um, there wasn't a whole lot there. I was very anxious about conducting the interviews, so I think I was really focused on process and didn't really get into analysis right away. But it offered me that perspective that slowing down, moving through the data with intention really did help me start to get to a place of understanding. So now I was ready to start exploring personal experiential themes. So I'm still working with individual transcripts at this point, but I'm trying to break from the chronology of the transcript and think thematically. So I started dumping key quotes into the notes section of a PowerPoint. And when I started seeing trends, I started categorizing them loosely and kept playing and playing until I had something that sort of resembled a mind map. So then I started designing the mind map on the PowerPoint slide and just sort of let my intuition tell me when I was done. So here's one of my 7 mind maps representing the personal experiential theme for one of the study participants. I wanted to make sure that I didn't lose really important quotes, what the IPA researchers call those gems, hidden gems in the data. So I highlighted them in yellow so they wouldn't get lost in the busyness of my map. I repeated this 7 times until I arrived at a place where I was ready to start thinking about group experiential themes and cross case analysis. So I was really comfortable with the first part. I have a background in English literature, closed reading, something we do all the time. But this time I was getting into some uncharted waters and I felt a little nervous, but I just sort of trusted the process. So I went back and I added color borders to each of my 7 mind maps so I could differentiate between them easily. I then individually cut out each of the little circles on each of my mind maps so I had all my data in a discrete way. It took so many hours of transcription work and analysis, all distilled down into these 7 little piles of paper that you see here. Um, Debwewin is a Anishinaabe word for truth, and Debwewin is symbolized by the turtle. So I thought, what truths could my cross-case analysis reveal? It took several hours of grouping and regrouping until finally I arrived at my group experiential themes. 7 unique perspectives now combined into something larger than the sum of its parts. I took a step back and I heard the voice of my helper. Mong, loon, and I knew I was on the right path. I had dreamt of the loon just the night prior. And for those who aren't familiar, the loon is a water bird that is very common in North America. For the Anishinaabe, the loon, Mong, holds great spiritual significance. There's many teachings and stories related to the loon, and it's also quite normal, I should add, for Anishinaabe people to speak of and draw spiritual teachings and guidance from their dreams. But obviously, this isn't really a common practice in academic research practices or contexts. So for me, when I heard the loon call out in this moment, I felt challenged in a good way to invite this messenger helper into my study in a way that felt authentic for me, regardless of academic norms or self-doubt that was creeping in about how my committee might react. So when I embraced this loon helper, Mong Oshkabewis, everything just started flowing, and I knew I was on a good path. So the study findings, therefore, will be discussed in an Monk way that brings the extant literature into conversation with Anishinaabe Gikandoso and knowledge, specifically related to the Mong Oshkabewis, the loon helper. So here's my table of group experiential themes that I eventually arrived at. I don't have time, obviously, to share all the findings and unpack everything, but I pulled out some important highlights from each theme that I'd like to share. One of the strongest sentiments to come forward was the deep importance and personal significance that participants placed on their learning and sharing about the calls to action. These personal motivations were varied, but they tended to relate to participants' lived experiences, their curiosities, and their empathy. The deep meaning that participants associated with their project functioned as an ojig anang, a metaphorical north star that guided and motivated them as they navigated various technological challenges, overcame personal insecurities to eventually arrive at their ultimate goals for their projects. I ask, what is the ojig anang of OER EP broadly? Wiley and Hilton's four-part test brings forward the what and the how, but not really the why. Why would we invite learners to participate in renewable assignments? Social justice may be the ojiganang, and with this orientation, we're perhaps less likely to fall into the trap of openness determinism, which erases learner agency and risks the enactment of colonial thinking and practices that are embedded in structures like the Creative Commons licenses. Participants also expressed a strong awareness of their imagined audience, which evoked for me the teachings of the Anishinaabe Dodamak, the clan system, specifically the Loon clan and the balancing of leadership through partnership with the Crane clan, which is part of our teachings. True leadership is about caring for and respecting the needs of others. True social justice advocacy requires the same. So, how can self and others be simultaneously honored through OER EP outputs? Study participants shared how they navigated these tensions, but I'll note that only 2 of the 7 participants disclosed that they've personally experienced accessibility challenges in their learning. And these same 2 were the only 2 to explicitly attend to the accessibility of their OER outputs. The third group experiential theme again related to authors' decisions related to their final projects. Openness determinism may have influenced them, as some expressed guilt or shame at selecting more restrictive licenses. The importance of thinking critically and contextually about many aspects of renewable assignments, both the process and the product, was underscored in this theme. License choice, degree of anonymity, assignment format, the accessibility of the resulting outputs are all really important considerations. And for me, this evoked an Algonquin legend called the Legend of the Shut-Eye Dance, which teaches us the importance of critical thinking, context, and courage when we share our stories and truths with others. The final theme evoked for me the teachings of the drum, a reminder that we're all interconnected and equal in our circle. This comes with a deep responsibility to all our relations. We're called to leave good tracks behind us and to share our knowledge in ways that are appropriate. I share my personal story of picking up the Hmong community hand drum as a representative example of openness as an ongoing negotiated process supported by many interconnected helpers. Related to this theme, participants shared encouragement and advice with educators, students, and others who are considering engaging in renewable assignments. So, some implications, real quick. Consistently, the participants demonstrated low levels of understanding related to open licensing and intellectual property rights. Never mind the coloniality that underpins some of these practices. So, explicit instructions required, and future research related to efficacy of these types of interventions could be really helpful, I think, for us practitioners. And then further, the accessibility or lack thereof of OER, which would include but wouldn't be limited to learner-generated OER, is certainly a trail worth following. How can we design renewable assignments in ways that attend to accessibility from the outset rather than retroactively? I imagine weaving the principles of universal design along with OEREP and social justice aims and how beautiful a braid that could be. Finally, all of the study participants described barriers in achieving their visions for their assignments due to technology challenges and lack of digital literacies. So, how can our student authors partner with tech savvy helpers to make these visions a reality? What role can academic libraries or learning commons play in this effort? Additional areas of future research could include explorations of factors leading to openness determinism, longitudinal analyses of learner perceptions of OEREP, the efficacy of learner generated content in various contexts, and others. So I'll end with Chimigwech. Big thank you to the study participants. Chimigwech Mang, Nimigwech Wenendam. I'm grateful, and also grateful to all of you for listening to me today. I'm closing with a few relevant links. I can dump them in the chat as well. And I'm just wondering, as practitioners, I'll have more time when I present this next. And I'm wondering what you'd be interested in learning more about as I transition from like a summary of the findings more toward a focus on like a workshop or application type activity in a conference context. So at Otessa, I'll be sharing this research, but also having a bit of real estate to talk about OEREP from social justice or maybe Anishinaabe teaching angles and see where that could lead us. Yeah, so I'll end there and I'll just like take all those links that I had up and dump them in the chat.
Thanks a million for the invitation, Beck. I'm just going to share slides and I popped them into the chat there, but I should preface this by saying I'm now for something completely different because I'm at a very different stage of work here than Jess. So 2 seconds. Hopefully that's visible to everyone. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well. If I can get it the right size, 2 seconds. Is that okay for everyone?
Looks great. Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, I actually feel that the title here might have been slightly ambitious in considering I'm very early stages in my journey here today, though I've been a practitioner for a really long time, but I set out, I suppose, sometime around last summer saying that I really need to get myself organized and figure out what it is I'm doing. And I think I've arrived at such a point in my career that I've spent half my career, 10 years teaching and 10 years in higher ed, working in ed tech and instructional design and learning design, that I think it was just about time that I start aligning some of my own values and interests and creative practice with the role that I've been doing and comparing that between the institutions I've been in. So just briefly, who I am is like I said, I've been teaching since 2005. It's coming on my 20th year, and I spent most of my career in higher ed in the University of Galway, the west coast of Ireland, and I was in a teaching and learning centre there. I joined ATU, which is also on the west coast, Atlantic Technological University, a large dispersed campus across the west and northwest, as an instructional designer 2 years ago. I'm chair of the Computers in Education Society of Ireland, a grassroots organisation of teachers from across the sector that have an interest in open, technologically enhanced learning, and an organisation that's been around since 1973. So I get to feel very young in light of the history of SESI, as our acronym states. But really, I am definitely more of a practitioner than a researcher. It is early days. I really didn't get up and running until probably around October, with the way these things go with systems and funding and all of that kind of thing. So in my practice, I've always been very focused on learning design, inclusive teaching. Definitely open practice has been there throughout the kind of the voluntary work and through my day job, and critical approaches to digital learning, says the cynical teacher in me that was trained and kind of came of age as a teacher in that space where every student was labeled as a digital native and digital was engaging and digital was going to fix everything. So I have a tense relationship sometimes with technology at best, but moving into the higher ed space and considering what I wanted to do in terms of my research, there's a part of me that's kind of glad it took this long to get to this point, because if I had had funding 20 years ago, I don't know what I would have studied, what I would have pursued. I definitely would have been interested in pursuing a PhD, but I'm not sure it would have been as relevant, or that I would have had the expertise in the area that I'm actually examining. So I want to look at the professional identity of learning designers, considering the wealth of roles and job titles and skill sets, and how vast and varied these things are, even in working in just two different institutions on the west coast of Ireland, learning, just seeing how very different things are. And where I've kind of arrived, I think, post-COVID, it's really at post-digital methods and a post-digital approach to learning design, that things are not quite as straightforward as they seem, in that, the digital and analog and the planetary concerns are largely connected. So my journey so far, like I said, I probably didn't really get started until around October, but I had arrived at a working title of towards a post-digital learning design paradigm. And just, I want to look at a qualitative study around the experiences and perspectives of the people doing this work, of learning designers in Irish higher education, and learning designer being kind of a portmanteau of instructional designer and learning technologist, which seem to be the two most prevalent titles here in Ireland anyway. So I'm in DCU, Dublin City University, in the School of STEM Education, Innovation and Global Studies, which I have been informed is the longest school name by my wonderful supervisor, Eamon, who is checking up on me here today, and James Brunton. I am pursuing a PhD by publication. I'm hoping that that works out accordingly, but it seemed like the best route for me at the time. And that focus is just really to gain some insight into the lack of research in this space about the professional identity, about the backgrounds of learning designers, especially in the Irish context, that there is, this research wider afield, but to inform that real work and those broader concerns, and to try to inform and develop a sort of generative model for post-digital learning design, that I think there's a rich tapestry of experience there that really isn't being tapped into in our institutions at all. So how did I get here? It's a very good question. I end up asking myself this quite a bit throughout my career. What's, I suppose, interesting about this is it didn't necessarily come from my day job. I had a Twitter DM at the time from Claire Thompson back in maybe 2018, who's become my collaborator. And she's moved around a little bit. She's now at Harriet Watt as assistant professor of digital pedagogies and course design. But she was doing she's still in the third space, but she was doing similar work as an educational technologist and digital education officer and a variety of other titles in Northern Ireland. And we built a partnership, writing a couple of book chapters over the last couple of years, that we've done workshops, we've exchanged guest talks, we've kind of remained grounded as a bit of a yin and yang of the north and south and the varied experiences, but building those connections. And I suppose similarly to my interest in being part of GoGN more broadly, is the broader I reach and the more I delve into practice and reflect on practice externally, the more I realized how my values really brimmed through that professional practice, and through kind of my creative methods and what that could mean for research. So it's very good to have a critical friend. If you have one, keep them. That poor Claire has been suffering now for 5 or 6 years in that space. And it's fantastic, I think, for both of us to have that sounding board. So just, I suppose, very quickly, we've written 2 book chapters together about our practice. And again, really, really interesting, I suppose, to work with someone in a different system and doing different work, and things functioning maybe slightly differently, but realizing how aligned our values and our work really are. So we wrote a book chapter on humanizing learning, online learning through engaged pedagogy, through that lens, some of our own vignettes around Bell Hooks's engaged pedagogy and what stood out to us throughout our own careers. And then we wrote a chapter in Higher Education for Good. That chapter focused on, similarly, it was humanizing learning design, but we took something I'd been toying with for a while, was this idea of digital pragmatism, that this struggle that I was having around my own critical approach to EdTech while working in a teaching and learning center, while working in a mainstream environment within a university and struggling to uphold my values and also toe the line in terms of what I had to do and what I had to support, and being very practical about that what I could do to be a bit subversive when I had to, and to skirt around things when I had to, but also to support people and not to make things more complicated. So we actually used Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy in that chapter to frame our thinking and to frame actually concrete examples for learning design in that space for people like us and for academics alike. And again, I suppose we ended up highlighting our really creative methods, at the unplugged methodologies we use, at the very engaging, methods that we had used, like zine making and Lego workshops and things for staff. So again, just highlighting some of that practice. And what we arrived at, just one of the activities and one of the suggestions was we had these educators activities throughout the chapters. Opt in. It might, you might not necessarily align to a new network, that you might figure out after a while it's not for you, but try to meet new people, try to sign up for a couple of new mailing lists, join a new community, join a Slack network, join a Discord, follow things. And I think what we really noticed in our own collaboration is that if we hadn't done that ourselves and been present in those networks and been doing that work, we wouldn't have arrived at the partnership we have. And I suppose similarly to an interest in Goji, and that our different networks sustain us in very different ways. And you can absolutely lurk at first, but you can opt in, like some of us are doing today. So what that's meant is that we've had opportunities based on the book chapters to get out there and trial a few methods. And again, I suppose because I'm at a point in my career where I have the experience and I have the practice, I've decided, just to trial things and maybe take my time before jumping into research methods. So a couple of things we've done recently is just at OER last year, we took some of the ideas from the book chapter and we ran a workshop to collate everyone's ideas. That we had a really nice kind of international range of folks that attended that session. And what we committed to as part of our open values was, with each of these sessions, we're going to create an OER and we're going to release it. So this one's on the National Teaching Repository. We've committed to our unplugged values and our engagement values. We just did tablecloths that you can see the scans there, that we scanned everything. I took them home and attempted to iron them and do all sorts of things to make them look well. And then I collated it into Canva to create a digital artifact that could be shared more widely. So this idea of being sustainable, of being generative, of actually creating something rather than throwing away, sticky notes or flip chart paper, and building on what we were doing and seeing what the different reactions were more broadly. And where that's kind of left me is realizing that my interests as a practitioner are probably not too different to what I actually want to do in practice as a researcher. That I value creativity. I like things being iterative. I like working towards something that's more generative. I like testing things in practice and seeing what works and seeing what doesn't. Another big piece of this, and I actually don't know how to articulate it quite yet, but maybe that'll come up in some GoGN chats. I think in the last couple of years, what's happening in the world is there's a lot happening. I'll say without comment, and really, what I feel it's done to me at a certain point is pushed me more into my former self, my younger self, into my DIY and kind of punk rock and activism roots. And all of a sudden I'm thinking about things, it's like anti-racist action and Food Not Bombs and some of the bands I used to be interested in and some of the movements I was really interested in. And at the heart of all of that, kind of that DIY movement, that whatever it is, whether it's music or activism, it's values based and it's very tangible and it's not mass produced. So I've been thinking a lot about this and what it means for me as an emerging researcher, and just to examine kind of the interplay for me really between third space researcher roles that not everyone like me is doing research, certainly not in my current institution, and they're certainly not looking at themselves, but how to employ that range of methodologies that we use in practice and how to potentially do that in our research. And just really that, the creative methods stem from creative practice, that things like zine making and speculative fiction, they work in tandem with things that are a bit more traditional. Like part of my day job has been to develop and to research and develop, I should say, a graduate program for learning designers. Whether that sees the light of day within the institution is another story, but that's been a very kind of traditional contrast to the more creative things I do, probably with staff and with colleagues. So I have a kind of a plan. I'm open to feedback on any of this. That I'm hoping for what I'm calling Dublin City University requires 3 papers. Because I'm just starting and I'm finding my footing. I had kind of arrived at that paper, let's call it 0.5, that probably won't be considered a full paper. Might be a commentary on my research methods and on the research methods that all of us in terms of my supervision team employ and what we're interested in. Then paper 1, I'm hoping to do a systematic review of the literature on learning designers, and I'll talk a bit more to that in a second. Hopefully paper 2 would be something around the data collection based on some zine making workshops that are, again, very, very much in my head as I continue to test the waters, and paper 3 being hopefully a generative model for post-digital learning design using speculative methods, so drawing on the findings from the workshops. So where I've been at recently, I trialed a zine making. I won't call it a workshop because it was online and asynchronous. For some of you might have seen the Third Space Symposium. The Third Space Symposium was held ahead of Ask Light, and this was the month-long online version. So it was very early stages, and I was just piecing together some resources and some ideas. So I didn't collect any data, and I didn't seek any approval. I just tried it out with a few colleagues, and it was on a Moodle site there, so I let folks have at it. So I've actually removed the Padlets and anything with the documentation, so you can see a preview copy that's linked to there, just with the structure and everything else. And it did help me to gain some insights around the experience. That's certainly one thing I learned if I attempted to do this online. Learning designers are going to use Canva because that's what they do. So I didn't set any barriers because obviously this is a voluntary, nice drop-in activity for a conference. So I'll definitely have to consider that if I was going to release anything like this to be done asynchronously. That no one opted for a handmade zine, and even the anecdotal feedback was really useful in terms of how I see the identity of third space professionals or learning designers. That I don't know if even my own colleagues see things, just very differently. In terms of, I've been an educator for 20 years and I've been in education. It's very much part of me. So it's interesting to see people that have come out of other careers or industry or engineering or kind of more corporate training. That it's a very different relationship. So it definitely helped. Then I was in Dublin City University a couple of weeks ago. Eamon had put me to work at the Education After the Algorithm conference, the symposium, I should say. It was a really nice couple of days. That there was a local critical studies and ed tech meeting. I have Eamon and Brian Mathers here hard at work. That it in the photo that, but we did something slightly topic wise a bit more off, that just based on the conference theme, Claire came over and we did an embedding sustainability literacies in post-digital learning design workshop, looking at ways to embed and kind of improve your practice in terms of your design, and examining kind of that messiness and inherent messiness of the post-digital structure. But again, to test out that methodology in terms of zine making, in terms of what to bring, what we needed, how to stand, how to, do we guide, do we stand back, what was the feedback from participants. So it was very, it worked out really well, and we have some actually really nice resources that, again, we're going to piece into an OER. But just the preparation methods in terms of, we got caught carrying out many, many boxes onto the corner and the road and figured out, how to get this stuff home. It was that kind of practical thing that almost to some extent, even in addition to the methodologies of how will I pull this off when I'm trying to do this with learning designers. So it's all a learning curve and it's all really, really useful. So the next steps, I am hoping to do a systematic review of the literature on learning designers and professional identity, and really, some of the existing research that colleagues have done in Ireland is that the role is largely under researched, and Eamon has hinted at things in his own work around that there's kind of this disembodied skills-based construction of learning designers in things like the job descriptions that don't really do justice to what those people bring to the table. And we do more or less exist in these strange liminal spaces and institutions where there's always a gray area in terms of, are you conducting research? Are you speaking at something, like a session like this today? Are we allowed? Are we not allowed? Who's doing what? And there's always that bit of trepidation, I think, in our space. That's it's I think there's always kind of a proceed with caution element to some extent in this work. And though on paper it says, at times that we're supported to do it within the institution and undertake this work, it's one thing for further study when you're funded to the institution. And, obviously we're grateful to be funded, but in practice in the day job, it's not always clear whether this is actually supported to do. And so I was very lucky that this was actually accepted, this, again, concepts of a plan to the Zurich conference, to the inaugural European Conference on Critical EdTech Studies. So I'm hoping to look at just the literature on the professional identity of learning designers using critical discourse analysis, really trying to look at the language, that how we can create better co-designed visions for the future by actually enabling and empowering the folks that are doing the work and including them in the research. So I just want to highlight any presence of power imbalances in the literature, that who's doing the research, what is being said about these people, by whom, how the rhetoric is currently shaping discourse on the professional identity of these folks, or LDs, as I keep calling them. But just to address any of those gaps, because again, when you're in a gray area in terms of actually doing the work yourself, who is talking about our work? And I know, even within the institution, we're not the ones necessarily consulted about the future of our roles, and that, it can be a concern. So it's, I hope, a very practical and useful piece of research for the sector. So she says very ambitiously, I hope to write a commentary piece for submission to Perspectives, Policy and Practice in Higher Education, that 2,500 word commentary, and work with my supervisors on that. That it was not accepted for the special issue based on the third Space Symposium, if I'm being 100% honest with that, unfortunately. But they suggested to submit that to the regular call for submissions. They had an overwhelming call, and to look at that Zurich conference is in June. It's wonderful to be accepted to that in that community as well. And really, what I hope to do is develop my process for the systematic review to have something to present that's kind of coherent, and get feedback from that community, obviously, and the Gojiang community as well. So that's kind of where I'm at. What I would say is, out of comments and questions, that I would ask for help and advice, probably a bit more frantically, because it is early days, and it's one thing, I think, to write these things down, but I think, a critical friend is always helpful, and I can't annoy Claire for everything, or Eamon, so that's why I'm here with this wonderful community. So hope that was of interest, and I'm open to any suggestions whatsoever.